Ladies and gentlemen, it is time now to invite our next speaker for a very special address. Please help me in welcoming Mr. Adam Donen, Director, Co-founder, 12th Battalion, Kaleida, to share his vision and enlighten each one of us. Welcoming you, sir.
It's a great pleasure to have been invited to speak to such august company. As my Google search profile will attest, my background is somewhat different to that of many here today. I direct movies and invent art forms. In 2014, I co-founded a production company, 12th Battalion Productions, which performs R&D into new audiovisual possibilities and makes artworks using them, as well as more traditional stuff like film. Our commercial division, Kaleida, has been responsible for the most watched hologram event in history and, relevant to today, many of the world's most prominent digital resurrections, some of which we can talk about, many of which we can't. Bringing the dead back to life using tech is obviously a very attractive idea and sounds like a great talking point. And like all great talking points, leads to an awful lot of chatter that bears little correlation to what is in fact possible, or ever likely to be possible, or desirable, and takes as read some really bizarre and often terrifying tech utopianism. So, today I'm going to be discussing some of the practicalities of creating a resurrection, whether a hologram that is installed on a location so a person appears to be really there, or for video, and generally, in both cases, making use of synthetic reality and deepfake technologies. Now, I was asked on a recent panel, can we disrupt death? I found the question very charming in a Silicon Valley tech world sort of way, and answered as any reasonable person would, no, of course not. Insofar as we're biological creatures that eat, sleep, fall in love, get stomach aches, cry at the sight of a beautiful landscape and so on, our time on Earth is limited and we must use it urgently and as best we can. But it is certainly possible for us, right now, to make something that looks like you, sounds like you, and moves like you. And not just some funny little deepfake straight to camera on TikTok, to be clear, the real thing. And it's ever more possible, and the quality of the simulacrum gets ever better. Put another way, to the extent that a person is a series of shapes, gestures, words, and sounds, this is highly replicable. So, how would one go about it? Well, one would start with the face, which means starting with the question, and this is the central question behind every digital resurrection, which you? One requires a lot of high-resolution video of your face from many angles, and crucially, one requires that they all be at the same period of your life. You may feel like the same person you were at 20, but synthetic reality datasets disagree. That's not to say they are right and you're wrong, just to say that they disagree. Indeed, a fascinating aspect of digital data banking in this sense is that if performed over years, one is creating iterations of oneself, not a fuller picture. It's harder than one would think, even for famous people above the age of 40, to gather sufficient material to create a really good simulacrum, though Kaleida and its sister company, the synthetic reality company, do it all the time. But for people under this age, if you post social media videos regularly and they're in high resolution, you've got little to worry about, at least where this is concerned. So, using these videos, we then create a data set which will be used, once we've shot our video content for the resurrection, and more on that later, to replace the face. Now, crucially, we need to cover all the angles in our data set that we will be seeing in the video. If not, the deepfaked face breaks and it looks very strange indeed. And we need to have real consistency between the faces that we put into our dataset. Otherwise, even though all the pictures are of you, we veer into uncanny valleys in the world of monsters. Curating datasets, in other words, taking out from the dataset those shots of you that look less like you and having only the ones that look more like you to the algorithm, is an art form. And then we get to the body and the movement. Now, you would think, if you're of a tech world mindset, that the best route here would be to use lots of video, capture the movement data, and aggregate it. It may seem obvious that the best way to capture and then depict a person's unique gestural qualities is to digitize it, analyze it, and then output it. But actually, doing this ends up with a Frankenstein's monster. Of all the different stages of a resurrection, This creates the most awful of the uncanny valleys if it's not done right. And time again, we've tried multiple approaches, and the best, by far, remains casting a body double and working slowly, painstakingly, and at length to replicate the flow of the gestures one wants for the specific resurrection one is performing of a person at a specific period in their life. Put simply, a well-trained actor will deliver better, more accurate movements than all the data analysis in the world. I don't know this will always be the case, but my instinct is that it will. The reason for this is that human movement is so tied to context, to the meaning of the words being said, to the circumstances in which one is saying those words, and to the meaning of the words that have come before. This is so multi-layered a problem that, even if it doesn't defy algorithmic analysis, it requires a level of semantic nuance which is currently simply incalculable. And that leads us elegantly onto the words and the voice. Now, often we've performed resurrections of singers, where the audio is necessarily a recording of one of their musical performances, and this is very elegant, because the presence of rhythm allows relatively easy lip sync, and one knows from the start one will have a fully authentic voice. But we've also performed resurrections where great politicians of the past perform a particularly important historical speech, where our instruction has been to use the exact recording of the speech made at that time. And while that creates huge choreographic and lip sync challenges, which will become obvious if you take any speech you think you know well, play it on YouTube, and attempt to say the speech in time to the person saying it. Nevertheless, if we manage to solve those possibilities choreographically, which we can, it's just very hard work, it does still create a huge degree of fidelity. You recognize the people's linguistic choices, you recognize the timbre of their voice, but also, and particularly, you recognize when they emphasize syllables, when they pause in the middle of sentences, and so on. And this is a huge subconscious driver of what we consider authentic, or a real person. But if we're not doing either of those things, if we're not using pre-recorded audio, one can, and one does, use a voice double, or at a stretch one can use voice synthesis, which is good in the moment, and it's getting ever better, but it's not really at a state where it is, shall we say, fully battle ready, though it will be, I would suspect, pretty soon, and we are working hard at it. And then, finally, having got through the audio, there are the issues of resolution. Now, the existing open source synthetic reality software is limited to a face size of around 700 pixels. This is absolutely fine for a cute video on Instagram, but it's wholly insufficient for, say, a TV series, or a hologram of a person in an intimate environment. We've been working very hard at this problem over the last 18 months, and we're already at a stage where we can get a good medium close-up, really good one, shot at 4K resolution, which makes it television ready, and where we can do this with a moving camera rather than straight face on, which is what you see on most synthetic reality, deepfakey stuff on the internet. So, with this thorough understanding of what's involved, and I've really gone into the weeds a bit, and how one goes about it, and generally it's not something people actually want to know how one does this. There's a German expression which translates roughly as, enjoy the flavour of the sausage, don't look at how it was made. But having explained it all to you, it's perfectly fair to ask, why on earth would anyone want to bring someone back to life as a synthetic reality creation? Well, money often has something to do with it. And that's fine in and of itself. I grew up as part of the generation that believed, and for some of us still believe, in authenticity, not selling out, and so on. And there are artists who are now departed, who I'd give my right arm to see live. Admittedly, I'm left-handed, but still. But when the living bands, rock bands in particular, reform as 70-year-olds and play the songs they played at 20, some of the time this can feel a bit of like a betrayal of the work they created, not really an honouring of it. And much as when I discussed faces earlier, I posed the question, which you are we resurrecting? So I think that the beauty of many of the great performers on a stage is the self they create or created, not the physical beings they happen to be at this moment in time. So in this sense, watching Mick Jagger do Paint It Black today, and I've done so for my sins, would be far less true to the self he created as a young man than to resurrect that self as a hologram. And if one were to perform the resurrection of the young Mick Jagger, The only unforgivable thing to do would be to do it badly, for it to not feel like him, with his movements, his face, his sneer. And the 70-year-old Mick Jagger does it badly. And this is why I regard it as essential to be not only working and developing the greatest synthetic reality tech, but also to have the strongest choreography in the world of resurrections. But continuing on the theme of why resurrections happen, much as dead pop stars manage to release albums endlessly, so it would not surprise me if there were A-list actors of the present whose careers blossom after their deaths. It's a perfect use case, to use the language of business. And the reason it works so well is because one is approaching what a person is at the realm of the image, or the public self, if you like. It's a very different case for people's private selves. Because of the work 12th Battalion and Kaleida and I have done, we receive heart-wrenching emails from time to time from people who have lost loved ones, who ask us to bring them back so they can talk to them again. And it breaks our heart to have to tell them that what we could do for them would do nothing but disappoint, or worse, to my mind, cloud their memories of the people they knew and lost who live on in real memories. In a chat with Laurie Siegel, she described a text bot that was created based on a friend of hers that answered her as her friend, and how she was shocked by how good it was. And this is very much possible in the realm of textual analysis. Our unique approaches to phrasing sentences, for example. I have a funny way of phrasing sentences. But our textual analysis of it gets ever better. And actually, our capacity to generate real-time synthetic reality faces is getting there too. And at the synthetic reality company, for example, we can already, say, apply a synthetic reality face on a Zoom call in real time but in low resolution. So that's not the technical challenge of bringing somebody back to life as a private person. Rather, the breaking point comes at the levels of A, the gesture, B, the timbre, and C, the meaning. We may think that we're the same person all the time, but we don't act that way. In every relationship you've ever had, it's likely that you've spoken slightly differently and that your gestures have been slightly different. And that's because at any point, we're not simply ourselves, but we're also ourselves plus the selves by which we surround ourselves. And since in private we are, ideally, not being monitored constantly, recorded constantly, to capture each of our 100 private selves separately is a very tricky business. Now, imagine, say, Nicolas Cage, with his grandiose, over-emphatic performances full of passion and urgency. And now imagine, though it would break my heart, Cage dying, and being asked to create a digital resurrection of him to sit with his wife late in the evening and talk to her, as she reminisces about a lovely holiday they had, visiting some castles in Scotland. "It was a great time, honey!" It doesn't work. If he would respond like that, it really wouldn't work. Now, what I'm describing, of course, is an extreme case of a dataset of a beautifully wild actor in his films being used to generate that which takes place in private. But it makes a vital point, which is that part of the peculiar grandeur of being human is how different we are at different times, to different people. Our many faces, if you like, which is not duplicity but humanity, our unpredictability. My friend Slavoj Žižek cites what Lacan calls the objet petit a to illustrate the point of our irreducibility. Suppose you have a baby and it dies, and someone comes to you and says, "Don't worry, I can exactly replicate it for you. You'll never know the difference." Would you respond with joy, or would you respond with disgust? If the answer is disgust, it's because you would take the view that the only thing that couldn't be reproduced is the most important bit of us, the bit that we know about and remember and feel, but that surpasses our understanding and our language. In the sunset of dissolution, everything is illuminated by the aura of nostalgia, writes Milan Kundera. Nostalgia, in other words, is not a quality of memory. It's what replaces memory. Which is why the other route to this problem, which is, rather than working off the facts of a dataset, albeit not a dataset matched to the circumstance for which it would be used, one could simply give people what they want, reconstruct the characters of their husbands such as they think they would like them to be, and which has its own problems. To create a person as a character, to depict them as a character, is necessarily to replace them with that character, just as nostalgia replaces memories. And I need go no further into that. So, should you want to be resurrected yourself? It's a tricky one. Wherever possible, it would seem infinitely preferable to me to communicate whatever one wants to communicate as oneself now, followed swiftly by capturing yourself in whatever formats you most wanted to live on, whether video or audio or hologram or similar, what have you, and that having us reanimate you after you died would only be the third best option. But, that said, I lost a dear friend and teacher last year, from whom I learned much of what I know about art. Can I conceive that if, on my 50th birthday, if I live that long, I sat down at a suitably celebratory venue, and there he was, on stage, saying some words I recognized were not him, but were the sort of thing he would have said to me? Would that make me happy? Yeah, I imagine there could be a tear in my eye, to be honest. And I recognize this also in Kanye West's approach when he asked us to resurrect his then-wife's father for her 40th birthday. It was a huge technical challenge, since there was so little footage of him. I spoke about those footage problems earlier, and that meant that our datasets were very sparse indeed. And so there are elements of it on a purely technical level that frustrated me and frustrate me greatly. But, from his point of view, I suspect the point was the magic of the surprise. In effect, to do the one impossible thing that, on one particular moment, would be more magical than anything else in the world for the person for whom it was being done. And I really do get that. So, speaking personally then, as I conclude, and beyond the interests of commerce and companies and so forth, my interest in this sphere is threefold. Firstly, in the private, deeply personal sphere, the question of what it means to be a human, relating to other humans, matters to me. I would like to think that we're capable of being, sometimes, not always, something more than a combination of words, sounds, shapes, and gestures. In short, that feeling and expressions of feeling are something more than mechanical, and further, that they can be experienced as such. Obviously, I can't know that I'll forever be deemed correct in this point, but thus far I am childishly delighted that the evidence is with me, and that there remains an essence to our private beings that is certainly currently not quantifiable and not replicable. It is just us, and only us. And thus far, whenever anyone claims to have cracked it, which they do from time to time, this is only because they're treating private conversation and love and empathy as a far shallower thing than our work suggests that it is. But secondly, going the other way, insofar as we are capable of imagining ourselves into being, as we're capable of acting the way we want to be and becoming the way we act, as pop stars do most obviously, but I think all of us do, to a greater or lesser extent. What we're doing when we create a performance of ourselves is we're creating a fictional character and we're living it. To the world then, at least in the public sphere, we are making a thing that is definable. And that thing, arguably, is one of the greatest artworks each of us will ever produce. And that thing, then, is like the score of a symphony, and it can be regarded as a creation for the future, a model that does not depend on one's actual living self to be useful to the world. For that's what a digital resurrection is. A self that lives on and is useful. I'm fascinated by this concept, and I'm excited by it. And thirdly, and finally, it remains my intention, one day, to shoot a movie with Humphrey Bogart as my lead. He remains the greatest, and it's a real shame he hasn't made any movies at all since 1957. I think we'd work very well together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for those fruitful insights. I'm sure it has been absolutely instrumental, and we look forward for imbibing those amazing takeaways. Thank you once again for your valuable time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they say we are the products of our thoughts. What we think, we become. And the best way to predict the future is by acting upon it. Because great ideas, they come to life when we act upon it. Our topic for the next panel discussion is cyber governance and data protection, the path ahead. So let's take a look at the powerful jury.